Well, Ethan, back for not another beer review, but an album review. I had to do one eventually. Uh, this is the fourth album from a legendary rock and roll band, generally labeled as or considered a hard rock act, sometimes considered influential to heavy metal. But all in all, just a great classic rock band from the 70s that began in 72, I believe, in Boston, Massachusetts, of all places. They are the Bad Boys of Boston, and this is Aerosmith Rocks. A little bit of glare there. I apologize about that. The 5 stones or jewels or diamonds on the front that is supposed to symbolize the 5 band members. You have Steven Tyler on vocals and harmonica, Joe Perry and Brad Whitford on lead and rhythm guitar. Brad Whitford, underrated guitarist. Love Joe Perry as well. He is the guitar virtuoso of this band. You got Tom Hamilton on bass and Joey Kramer on drums. Longtime member Joey Kramer. I believe he and Steven Tyler appeared on all their studio albums to date. Like I said, this is their 4th album, released May 14th, 1976, recorded in February and March of 76. The studio was Warehouse in Massachusetts, record plant in New York City, on the Columbia label, produced by Jack Douglas. This followed up the hugely successful Toys in the Attic. I have that on LP, vinyl, which was kind of the band's big breakthrough. They released their first album, self-titled, in 73, and then Get Your Wings in 74. Toys in the Attic was 75, and they followed this up right after in early 76. So they were pumping out albums every year at this point. And this is probably my favorite album of theirs. I generally think their 70s period is much better than their 80s period and their early 90s. They made a lot of money and had a lot of success with those 80s and 90s hits, Crying, Janie's Got a Gun, the one for Armageddon. How does it go? I can't remember the name. But they had all those huge hits in the 90s. But I generally like their 70s stuff a lot better. And this album in particular, Rocks, I think is just excellent. You have, to kick it off, excuse me, Back in the Saddle, classic song. Excellent riff, amazing bass line throughout that song. It kind of starts out with sort of the clip-cloppity horse hooves, sort of a Western themed, just a raunchy hard rocker, just a great riff, heavy song for 1976 too. That's another thing. This album is heavy, very heavy for 1976. You hear Aerosmith later, and then you go back and listen to this. This was much heavier. This was like, think Ted Nugent meets Black Sabbath almost. Not quite as heavy as Black Sabbath, but the riffing and the soloing, it's almost Ted Nugent Cat Scratch Fever-esque. Or even, what's some other bands at the time that were this heavy? Not a whole lot. Deep Purple comes to mind. Black Sabbath comes to mind. Ted Nugent comes to mind. Maybe like Y&T. Not a whole lot of bands were this heavy. Especially in America. England had the big bands that were heavy. Zeppelin, Purple, Sabbath, but this was a heavy album and band for the United States of America. For America, just a lot of heavy bands had not come here yet. AC/DC was still in Australia. They didn't release their first album here until later in 76, I believe. Well, it was 76 in Australia and then later in the States. So this was early, heavy material. I mean, go check this album out. This is heavy stuff. If you haven't heard some of these songs, or if you only know Janie's Got a Gun, or Crazy or Crying, or Don't Want to Close My Eyes, or whatever the song is called. I like those songs. They're pretty good, but this is where it's at. This is where it's at, people. Second song, Last Child. Excellent. Kind of starts off kind of eerie and ominous, a little atmospheric. Really good song. I like it. Underrated. Rats in the Cellar, the third track. Oh, that's a great song. It's almost speed metal. That wasn't a term that was thrown around at the time in 76, but man, Rats in the Cellar, fantastic song. Just a nasty, funky riff throughout that song. You got a breakdown in the middle of it around the 2 minute 30-second mark, and then it kind of goes into a harmonica solo. If there's a hard rock song with a harmonica solo, you know it's awesome. And Rats in the Cellar, fantastic song. Underrated cut on this album, in my opinion. Combination, the next song, really heavy. Kind of a slower, trudging song with a nice heavy riff. From Perry and Whitford. Written by Perry himself, with no help from Steven or any of the other guys. The next track is side 2, Sick as a Dog. Really good song. Just a kind of funky, raunchy rocker. The next song, track, 6, is Nobody's Fault. Wonderful song. Very heavy. Underrated song for them. And actually, the band Testament, the thrash metal band from the 80s, they covered that song. And I actually heard it from them first. Testament covered Nobody's Fault. And then I went back and heard the Aerosmith original, and I was like, whew, that is a heavy song. No wonder they decided to cover that song, because it is so, heavy and metal in a lot of ways. Get the Lead Out's the next track. It's not the second half of the album, not quite as good after Nobody's Fault, falls off a little bit. Lickin' a Promise is kind of a good kind of, boogie-woogie song. Home Tonight, the last track, kind of a ballad. Don't like that one so much. But I would say the strength of this album is the first side, and Nobody's Fault is the standout track on the second side. So tracks 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, or 4, I'm sorry, and then track 6. The rest is not as good, so not a perfect album. Every song is not great, but, 5 songs out of 9, this album is pretty solid through and through. And I wanted to read on Wikipedia, just in case you don't believe me, how influential this album was to later rock and metal acts in the 80s. Many musicians have cited Rocks as a favorite. Rocks was one of Kurt Cobain's favorite albums, as listed in his journals. In 2003, the album was ranked number 176 on the Rolling Stone magazine's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, maintaining the rating in a 2012 revised list before it dropped to 366 in a 2020 revised list. I usually don't care about, Rolling Stone lists, but it's deserving. Motley Crue's songwriter and bassist Nikki Sixx refers to Aerosmith frequently in his book, The Heroin Diaries. Metallica leader James Hetfield has identified Rocks, as well as Aerosmith, as important influences in his music, stating that the band was the reason why he wanted to learn to play guitar. There's a big one for you. Slash of Guns N' Roses says Rocks was the album that inspired him to learn guitar. And that's interesting to note about that. I notice a lot of similarities between how Slash plays and how Joe Perry of Aerosmith plays. I really think Slash was hugely influenced by Joe Perry, and Joe Perry probably by I'm drawing a blank here. I don't know why I can't think of it. I had a brain fart. But I really, and it goes on to say how Slash was actually really influenced by Aerosmith and Cheap Trick, and Rocks was, he said, we're hanging out and someone put it on Rocks by Aerosmith, and he says he was mesmerized by it. It was like the be-all, end-all, best attitude hard rock record ever. I'd grown up with music, but this was like my record. So he loved it. So very influential to Slash. He was a fine guitarist in his own right. Don't really care much for Guns N' Roses anymore. Kind of burned out on them, but just from, those couple guys I mentioned, they were hugely influenced by this album. No doubt. If you don't believe me, look it up. There's some cool pictures in here of the guys. There's Joe Perry. Got some pictures. Really cool stuff. Look at all that. There's Steven. And I do want to say, I think Brad Whitford, the rhythm guitarist, grossly underrated rhythm guitarist. Joe Perry gets a lot of the he gets a lot of the spotlight and the praise for a lot of the Aerosmith guitar playing and riffs, but in my opinion, Brad Whitford, he came up with some just nasty fat riffs in this band, especially around this time period. Toys in the Attic and this one rocks. And the next one, too. I really love the second album, Get Your Wings. That thing is great. But anyway, he, underrated rhythm guitar player, Brad Whitford, Joe Perry's other half. Jimmy Page was who I was thinking of, Led Zeppelin. I don't know why I blanked. Everybody knows Jimmy Page. But I think Joe Perry was influenced by Jimmy Page, and then people like Slash and other guys in the 80s were hugely influenced by Joe Perry in the late 70s. So it's kind of like the domino effect of hard rock bands, each influencing the other. It's kind of really interesting how that works. But yeah, Rocks by Aerosmith, fourth album from them. Really like it. I'd give it it's not a perfect album. Aerosmith is by no means one of my favorite. Well, they're not my favorite band. They're probably not even in top 10. They're not a phenomenally groundbreaking band by any means. They are hugely popular and iconic. Not my favorite band for sure, like I said, but this album and Toys in the Attic specifically, I think are really good. Really the peak of this band. And I'd give this album a 90 out of 100. An A minus. I could do stars, or I could do, 1 to 10, but I generally like the 1 to 100 range because it gives you more flexibility in choosing more numbers. So I'll give Rocks a 90 out of 100 for a music score for an album. I like it. Again, not perfect, not my favorite band, but really solid, classic, influential hard rock, 70s hard rock album, Aerosmith Rocks. Thank you for watching this album review. Thank you for subscribing, liking videos, commenting. I appreciate it all. Hopefully I'll be getting to more of these because I love talking about music and beer. Two of my, main interests, really. Cheers, and thank you for watching.